Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Kidney Coach YouTube channel. I am naturopath Fiona Chin, co-founder of the Kidney Disease Solution and Kidney Coach, and our range of supplements, Kygenesis. Oh, I can't even pronounce it today. Kygenesis, which is a range of supplements designed for people that have been diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. And I'm joined again today by one of my favorite guests, Jessianna Saville. Jessianna is the head renal dietitian at Kidney Nutritional Institute. My words, I need more coffee. And she heads up the renal team there. She's a renal dietitian. She's amazing because she works on treating the person and not the disease causes, not effects. Jessianna is all over the latest research coming out when it is related to all things kidney disease, renal health, and she's amazing at her ability to take the latest research and actually integrate it into her clinic, which I always appreciate because she's far further in front than most people you talk to, and definitely not stuck in the Stone Age when it comes to treating renal disease. Jessianna, thank you again for joining me.
Excited to be here.
So we've been doing a bit of a series on amino acids. So we're up to we just talked about them in general last time. And so we're actually now going to dive into each of the individual amino acids. And we're starting today with L-Arginine. So let's get straight into it. I'm just going to hand it across to you. First off, tell me, what is L-Arginine?
So, and just to give a little bit of background, if maybe this is the first time you're joining us. So protein is like the hottest topic in the kidney world, and it goes on this big pendulum between like, we should eat like, don't worry about protein. Okay, eat very low protein. Okay, like take keto analogs. Okay, like do, and there's this big like conversation, plant proteins, animal proteins, and really, I think a lot of patients get protein whiplash, and it's it's interesting because when you work with patients day in and day out as we do, you start to see that a lot of the confusion that surrounds protein is purely because it is very specific to the person. And that's really what we're wanting to address as we go through each of these amino acids, is not just thinking about, protein in general, but amino acids, these are the little building blocks of protein, and they all kind of run on these different pathways. So when you draw this big arching thing saying we should eat a lot of protein, or we should eat a little bit of protein, or people that are old need more protein, you're really missing the point, because you need to think about these amino acids and how they're being utilized for the individual. And I think we'll see that when we go through L-arginine today, on how this one amino acid plays into some very specific problems that people with kidney disease have. And again, when you understand that, now you can really get some precision nutrition. You can really be able to understand when you're going to supplement, how long, what you're going to supplement, what you're expected to see. Uh, and you always use supplement over the foundation of like a good diet. But I'm hoping that this will really help resolve some of the big questions people have about protein as we go through each of these amino acids.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for
okay,
clarifying.
so
Yes.
that was a little bit
That,
of
that was
background. The L-arginine,
needed.
yeah. So
Yes. No, good. L-Arginine.
L-arginine is considered semi-essential amino acid. So really, to get enough arginine, you're going to have to eat it. Some amino acids, some of these little building blocks of protein, our body just generates them inside. It's got its own little factory, amino acid factory, and it makes them for us. Some of them are essential, meaning we have to eat them in order to have enough. So arginine fits in that category. Um, and there actually is quite that there's I want to say there's tons of studies on arginine and kidney disease in humans, but there are lots of studies on arginine in like specific factors that tie back to kidney disease in humans. And that's what we want to kind of touch on tonight.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so semi-essential amino acid, meaning we need to eat it through food. So let's cover the basics for people. Foods that are high in L-arginine. What sort of foods are people looking at to eat to get it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you're thinking on plant foods, pumpkin seeds, which we also love for zinc and magnesium, everything else. Pumpkin seeds are actually very rich in arginine, so that can be a good source. Um, Otherwise, several of the meat, the animal products, eggs are quite rich in
Mm.
arginine. Some animal proteins are very rich in arginine as well, which I know in the kidney world now we have this confusion. Well, should I eat the plant? Should I eat the animal food or not? Again, it comes down to some balance. But on a plant side, I think pumpkin seeds are one of your really, really robust sources that you can use to put it into your diet.
Perfect. Okay. And when it comes to kidney disease, so let's dive straight into it because I'm trying to think of any other things with arginine that we need to cover, but let's get into the nitty gritty. So first off, what biochemical processes in the body does L-arginine work on? So, you
So
mentioned
one
that.
of the big one that we'll talk about really two tonight, but the big one that you see in a lot of the studies, even when you look at arginine in other conditions like heart health and erectile dysfunction and like all these other things, it comes down to vascularization, which is in the nitric oxide cycle. So nitric oxide is a vasodilator, so it's what allows your vessels to expand, which is of course very important when you think of the kidneys in blood pressure in particular. So nitric oxide, arginine, we eat our, whatever, eggs or pumpkin seeds, they break down into these little blocks, these little building blocks. So arginine would be used to turn into nitric oxide. And that's where it's really studied quite a bit, is specifically on that pathway.
Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know, nitric oxide is a vasodilator, meaning it relaxes
Yeah.
blood vessels, expands them, so lowering blood pressure, allowing more blood flow into kidney tissue. Okay, so that's the big major pathway that L-arginine or arginine feeds into. What about some sub-pathways that arginine is involved in that is worth a mention?
So there's two other that would be really important, and then we can kind of talk through how you think about this in disease states. But the other two, and I'm thinking about this primarily from a nutrigenomic standpoint, because nutrigenomics, you look at people's SNPs and are they upregulated or downregulated? How efficient are people at, creating different enzymes? So there's two others that are really interesting when you tie back to L-arginine. One is the BH4.
Mhm.
Um, and the other one is the ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, which everybody with kidney disease generally is familiar with because there's a whole class of medications, ACE
Yeah.
inhibitors, that is tied back to this. So you have these other two that L-arginine plays into. With ACE inhibitors, um, the ACE enzyme competes with ENOS for L-arginine. So they're kind of at odds, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second. And then BH4 has a lot of other ties back to L-arginine, because if you push too much L-arginine in and your BH4 enzyme is really reduced, you end up actually having some problems because you can't convert that nitric oxide or the arginine effectively into nitric oxide. So then you get all these superoxide inflammatory molecules. And there's interventions you can do to look at that. But these are like really these other three pathways that I think about really tie back to kidney disease.
So let's dive deeper into that, and then we'll talk about specific conditions where you might think about arginine at the end. So anyone that doesn't know, epigenetics, nutrigenomic tests, Jessianna and I both run those in clinical practice. So there's three SNPs that we would look at when it comes to arginine potentially being a effective amino acid to use, and that is the NOS3, NOS3, the BH4, and then the ACE. So walk us through exactly what you're talking about, but let's go deeper with all of those. So let's start with the NOS pathway and talk about exactly how arginine works with that, and then get into those nitty gritties that you were sort of alluding to when it comes to what happens if we maybe use arginine and you've got, say, you're homozygous for, and I'll let you explain to people what that means. Say you're homozygous for the BH4 SNP, and maybe you've got an ACE, heterozygous. So walk us through those really specifics for people thinking, oh, I was thinking about using L-arginine, maybe I shouldn't, or should I use it? So yeah, walk me through those, Jessianna.
Okay, so I'm gonna flip your question around just a tiny bit, because I think there's another way we would think about this is typically when I'm looking at somebody's nutrigenomics, I I'm I sometimes will look for specific SNPs and say, oh, like you're at risk for XYZ. More often though, people have a problem, for example, high blood pressure, and I'm trying to understand what are the things that are driving into high blood pressure for you, because it's really different for every single person. Or maybe they have like very like definitive like inflammation, like you can just see it with like the multiple symptoms they have, and be like, well, I wonder where your inflammation's coming from, because that's pretty broad. So that's a that's important for me, because when I'm thinking about the pathways of L-arginine, I'm not necessarily looking at it and be like, okay, I think who, like, do you need L-arginine or not? Usually what I'm saying instead is your blood pressure is high. You've had a really hard time with blood pressure medications, bringing your blood pressure down. Like you're almost kind of resistant to them. And you just kind of like, you're playing this dance all the time with like, you increase your blood pressure medication. Now it's too low. Okay. So then you take it off, but now it's way too high. Okay. So then you add another one, but then it makes you feel weird. And so like people really play like around the merry-go-round with blood pressure medications, trying to get the formula that's going to work right for them. When I see that scenario, then I say, oh, well, it's not just blood pressure because you have kidney disease, or not just blood pressure because that's your family history. There's a pathway in your body that's a problem because of that. So for nitric oxide, so if that was the case, someone's like, we're really struggling with
Mhm.
blood pressure, huge component. Then I would look at SNPs. I'd say, okay, well, I wonder how your NOS3 pathway is, because if you are not producing nitric oxide, then you are definitively going to have some problems with blood pressure, because your blood vessels cannot expand and contract and expand and contract. So so that's where I would look at NOS3. And if I say, whoa, like for you, your NOS3 in genomics, we say it's down regulated, which means that the SNP is slow. If I look at that and I'd say, oh, like you're just really not very efficient in this pathway, then in that case, I say it potentially would be a go for us to see if L-arginine works for you, because it is the precursor to producing nitric oxide.
Perfect.
The only exception to that, which I also want to pull back in, is that you can't just say, I don't want people to come away from this and say, oh, if my blood pressure's high and I've been dancing around blood pressure medications, I should definitely try L-arginine. Like, let me give it a go. L-arginine, when you look at the studies, it actually has these negative effects and positive effects. It's on both sides of like the spectrum here. And the negative effects are so interesting, because you see it in the animal models. They saw really negative effects for people with glomerular nephritis in particular. And that's super fascinating, because you think about uh, itis being inflamed, right? So your glomeruli are very inflamed. That's probably not a situation where you want to be like really dilating that part of your body. So uh, in those cases, you wouldn't want to use L-arginine. So I'd look at it and say, oh, NOS3 is not super great, but I'm not really so sure I'm going to add in a bunch of L-arginine at the moment if you've got a whole bunch of inflammation going on with your glomeruli.
And do you think, because we talked about this before we hit record, and now I'm thinking about it, do you think too that people with a lot of itis are probably under a high oxidative stress load and potentially have a downregulated BH4 pathway? Now I'm thinking about it. And so then, and I'll let you explain that of why that's important, but
Bingo. So that's exactly right. So the BH4, and let me just pull up my notes here, because these are always really complicated for me. Okay. So BH4 is another enzyme that's really, really important when you're looking at L-arginine. BH4, if it's downregulated, and then you add on, I mean, it ties into like being able to metabolize glucose really well. It ties into being able to manage stress well. So if you have a really cruddy BH4 pathway and you have a high carbohydrate diet or high sugar diet, or you've been under a lot of stress, your cortisol levels are super high, and you already stink at this BH4 production, you're going to be even worse. And you're going to really struggle with a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation. And
Mhm.
so, some of the strategies that you look at is that what you may need to start with is really helping address BH4 depletion. Because if you just don't have a lot of this enzyme, it's going to be really hard to get any sort of progress with the blood sugar or with anything else. So if you're really struggling with that, that might be a chance before you like jump on L-Arginine. Maybe that's a time where you look at doing a little bit of a lower carbohydrate diet, or at least learning how to balance those carbohydrates so you're not pushing your blood sugar up all the time. Um, that might be a time where you do a very specific, even elimination diet to tackle inflammation. It would be a time where you could really look at reducing oxidative stress, and that could be with a supplement. It could be with other factors that might be playing into that. And then you could look at using arginine once you feel like those are stable and improved to potentially improve the blood pressure. Or you may not need to at that point because it's
Yeah.
it's
And that was the
the
big
domino
thing
effect.
is exactly, because if you supplement, so say you, like to your point, you saw that the NOS was out and you're thinking, okay, well, I'm just going to put in L-Arginine, but BH4 is cruddy, which I love that word. The point in the studies was saying that if you added arginine, even though arginine does support BH4, but if it is so downregulated and you put in L-Arginine, you actually increase BH4 pushing through into oxidative byproducts. So it's going to cause more oxidative stress by supplementing with L-Arginine. So in those
Yeah,
cases,
that's exact. Yep, that's
yeah,
exact. So then you just get this really vicious cycle, right? Where you're
yeah,
like, I've got a lot of like oxidative stress. Okay, I'm gonna add an L-arginine. I gotta address my blood pressure. Okay, now I have a lot of uncoupled nitric oxide molecules. Now I have more oxidative stress, and you're just like going round and around, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So there's definitely some caution with how you would look at L-arginine. Could be great for many people, but always good to just kind of step back and take the whole picture before you dive into like this very tunnel vision of using one supplement to treat one thing,
yeah.
because that's always where you get into trouble.
And it always comes back to what we talk about, you and I talk about all the time, is inflammation and oxidative stress. You need to get those under control first, stress levels and good healthy diet before we do. And they're easy places to start before we sort of really get into all of this sort of individual stuff. Because if you get all of that cleaned up, then at least anything you're putting in on top, you know that you potentially aren't contributing. So at least it takes us back to naturopath nutrition 101, I guess, with all of that sort of stuff, which makes sense. So the third pathway that you mentioned is the ACE gene. So talk to me about if is arginine useful in that, and how, and what does that look like? And of course with ACE inhibitors and blood pressure medication, because I found those studies were super interesting.
Yeah. So what I saw here, and again, I have to pull up all my notes. It
Right.
takes a lot of brain power to work through all these. So if I look over to the side, I'm looking at my notes. So, so the angiotensin converting enzyme, it competes with eNOS for L-arginine.
Mm.
So that potentially means you're going to have less nitric oxide production, less vasodilation, um, if your ACE enzyme is not balanced correctly. And so that's going to be a problem. So, what they see in the research that's kind of interesting is that if you are on an ACE inhibitor, so these are all the medications usually that end in ill,
Yeah,
at the
that's yeah.
end, IL. um, if you're on an ACE inhibitor, some of the studies have shown that when you supplement a little bit of L-arginine with it, it actually can improve the impact of it, and you'll have a better outcome.
I love these studies.
So the clinical application on my side is I say, okay, if I'm having somebody again doing the blood pressure dance, They try this medication, they try that medication, they change this dose. Now they've tried to do it at different times of the day. Like they're trying to get the formula right. Sometimes they get a formula that's pretty close, but they're still a little bit high, but at least they're not super low and feeling awful. So maybe they're running like 140 over 80 all the time. And that's not ideal. It's better than 160. And but there's nothing that works for them. Some of the other blood pressure medications make them feel bad. They've tried a bajillion different things. They don't know what to do. That person would be a really good situation to say, hey, let's try adding a little bit of L-Arginine as a supplementation and see if we can't really help support um, the ACE enzyme anyways, and see if we can get just a little bit more impact from the medication that is already giving you some help. And that's the case when I would use that. You might have a better way to explain that pathway than me.
No. I mean, from what I read in those studies, it's exactly what you said, was that the study showed that, and we know with blood pressure, often people are on multiple medications. And I wonder whether a better way of looking at it is if the ACE pathway, say from nutrigenomics, you can see you've got an ACE SNP. So you think, okay, ACE blood pressure medication might be very useful in this person. The studies do show that rather than having to use, say, an ACE and maybe you've got a calcium channel and a diuretic, why don't you try an ACE first? Look what your SNPs are looking at. Make sure you're not under an oxidative load and the BH4 isn't depleted, because that would be a flag where I go, don't do this. But if that is all looking good, then I would probably run L-Arginine alongside an ACE inhibitor first before using diuretics, calcium channels, so you're not having that big medication load that the kidneys have to filter. But running L-Arginine first to see if that gives you just that little edge, because it's supporting the NOS pathways, and because arginine isn't being depleted because of this competition that you spoke about through NOS and the ACE pathways, that then you get a better blood pressure control through using something like an amino acid versus having to use other medications, which again, your kidneys filter everything, right? So it's an extra load on the kidneys, especially diuretics. And we've spoken about this in other podcasts, can sometimes have a negative effect on kidneys. So I think healthcare practice, and again, you know, a nephrologist and doctors may not have, if they get 4 hours of nutrition, whereas it's something like you and I might look at this and go, well, why don't we just try Arginine in this case to see if we don't have to run you with a whole pile of other medications just to get, like you say, the 140 on 80 in kidney disease. We just don't want that extra pressure in the kidneys, and it just might give us that edge because of the support to the nitric oxide pathways. So think I said exactly what you did, just a different way.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to think about it. And I was thinking while you said that, I said, well, why, the question that usually I get a lot of times is, I'll get and talk through this with a patient, and then they'll say, well, why can't I just eat? Like, why can't I just eat a food that's high in L-Arginine? Which is a good question. However, usually what I will tell them is I'll say, well, um, repleting with food is a little bit slower than a supplement. And so sometimes if we want to figure out if this is going to work for you, there is benefit in using a supplement temporarily. Again, I love to think of medications and supplements a lot of times as a bridge until the nutrition can catch up.
That's a
So,
great, yeah,
so sometimes I'd say, well, let's do the supplement for 30 days and see what happens, because if that supplement makes the difference for you, then I mean, making our very best, making our very best guess using all the data we have. If that supplement works for you, then we know for sure that that's something we want to focus on in your food. And then I can switch the food strategy a little bit, and I'd say, okay, well, let's add in whatever, some egg or pumpkin seeds or whatever we're going to do to make sure there's enough L-Arginine. And once I know that that's robust in their diet, then I say, well, why don't we try stopping the supplement and let's see how you do. And sometimes the diet is enough at that point that they don't need the supplement, or sometimes they stop and they're like, I'm going to keep the supplement on. And I do have some people that they just, honestly, they can't eat enough to get enough to support some of those biochemical pathways. So we use a supplement, but at least we know, right? Is this going to help you, or,
exactly. I think
long term? But I'd love supplements to kind of test out the theory and figure out, is this really how you're working? And if it is, then super. Then we kind of move that direction.
No, I think that's perfect. And we touched on it before, but I just want you to go back and just say again, the cases that we would think L-Arginine is something that I wouldn't consider, or that I might think maybe not causes more damage, but it'd be something.
Okay. Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, this came actually from a really excellent paper by Chirla Jowdam and Edgar A. James. And this was in 2004 in the Journal of Nutrition. So this is a while back. It was such a super duper paper on arginine and the pathogenesis of renal disease. But what they comment on and pull the data from in their paper, I'd love to see if they have a follow-up paper after this. But they say that arginine supplementation in animal models of glomerulonephritis has been shown to be detrimental, probably because you have this increase of nitric oxide, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think this is a really wise statement. It's such a practical paper. L-arginine supplementation does not modify the course of renal disease in humans with chronic glomerular diseases. They say, but however, you'll see some beneficial effects of L-arginine reported in some different cases of chronic kidney disease: renal ablation, ureteral, I can never say this word, ureteral obstruction, probably still said it wrong, nephropathy secondary to diabetes, and salt-sensitive hypertension, as well as preeclampsia. And so I think what I love that this paper talks about is that you're going to see some support, like L-arginine being a supportive amino acid in some cases, but it's not the end all resolution. It's almost like it's supporting things that are going to impact the progression of kidney disease, but it's not the solution necessarily.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to what we said before, that if you've got any condition that is creating an abundance of oxidative stress and inflammation, which anything itis, inflammation does, I suspect there's probably BH4 issues. You go adding in L-arginine, and you're going to be pushing a further oxidative burden onto the body. So that's why I love what we do, because we can become really true investigators and go back and go, what's the SNP doing? Is this what's happening here? You can do urine tests for nitric oxide from memory. They're the ones that go purple, and you can see it in certain tests and things like that. And then, of course, we're running nutrigenomics. So with all of that, people like Jessianna and I can put all of that information together and go, okay, there's a huge amount of oxidative stress going here. I'm not going to go near L-arginine, versus there's a NOS deficiency. Maybe there's an ACE inhibitor. L-arginine is probably going to be very effective in this case because oxidative stress is under control. BH4 pathways look like they're working well. Methylation's good. So we'll use it in there. And I think that then becomes a good solid foundation for us to think about when we would and wouldn't use L-arginine in those particular cases where people are maybe not producing enough nitric oxide and they need a little bit of support that way. And like back to your point, does supplementation work? Yes, great. Can we then get it through diet? And if not, maybe we just keep a little bit in there to support the nitric oxide pathways, which makes, I love this.
I love that.
I feel like that was a good deep dive on L-arginine. Is there anything you want to
so
about?
Interesting? These amino acids, like every time I read a new one, I just like blow my mind. And honestly, so much of this study, I have to be so transparent. It is inspired by the patients that come in and work with us and ask great questions. In fact, this whole like idea to do amino acids this year came from a patient, a retired nurse. And we played around with a couple amino acids and we're like trying to dig into like, how come this works for you? How come that works for you? And I was like, I need like a better like format in my head to start stratifying this. So much of the work that we do is inspired by patients. I'm so grateful for the people that come and work with us, and they're willing to kind of really dig into what does not exist in the kidney disease world to find their own solution, because it's so individual for every single person. And I see that the longer I work in kidney disease. It's not just plant-based, it's not just keto, it's not just keto analogs, it's not just this, it's not just that. It is the individual finding their own formula, and then the kidneys just perk up and they're really able to thrive. Yeah.
Such a great point. You're absolutely right. And it's a privilege to work with patients. And like you say, that whole individual thing. And I find the same as you. There is no one thing that works for everybody. I wish it was that simple, but it's so not. It really is just finding that the key that unlocks it individually. And that's, you know, that's great when you know that, and also frustrating because sometimes it means what you think will work for one person won't work for another, and it's just trial and error. But as you say, you and I really get our rocks off, is that the right word, on figuring this stuff out and working it, because, you know, I love it. We have, and before we hit record, Jessianna and I have these great conversations as we end up down a great big rabbit hole about an amino acid. So it's not many people that you can rock out to with amino acids. So thanks, Jessianna.
Totally agree. Lots and lots of fun.
Great. Well, if you want to know more about what Jessianna does, I'll drop in her details below, but she's the kidneynutritionalinstitute.org on the internet there. They work with people all over the world. They can work with your insurance companies and all of that great stuff as well, because they do telehealth and all that sort of thing. She's got a whole team that supports and works with her, because Jessianna gets super busy as well. So if you want to know more about what she does, head to the website and have a look. They've also got a lot of free resources on there, which are great as well. So you can have a look at that. If you want to know more about what we do, head to www.kidneycoach.com. You will find us also on Facebook and Instagram. Jessianna, thanks again for joining me. We will be doing a new amino acid every time Jessianna and I catch up. So make sure you hit subscribe and like. That way you'll get notified every time we pop up a new video. Thank you for being part of our community. And if you have any specific questions, drop them below and I'll make sure I get back to you. Thanks again. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.